Thank you everyone for joining. I'm probably the only non-academic presentation on today, but a very important one for our program. I don't want to lose the laptop again. Okay, that should work. So my name is Lauren Waring. I'm the research lead at the Centre for Economic Policy Research. So I'm a member of the team that implements all of our projects within the Growth Research Platform. So that includes private enterprise development in low-income countries, which is also called PEDAL, and structural transformation and economic growth, which is also called STEG, and of course the ReCIPE program, our brand new one. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit more about the grants that we're starting off very, very soon. Grant giving is a main part of our program, and it's one where we're very keen to engage with the wider research community and all the people engaging with the topics that we've been talking about yesterday and today. So a little bit just about ReCIPE. Many of these things have been mentioned before, but we are a program that's part of a larger initiative. We're also funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which will come up again later on. The aim of the program is to have a better understanding of the links between conflicts, economic growth and public policies. So we do that in a number of different ways. There's a few specific questions up there that are sort of guiding for the program as a whole. And then, as we have repeatedly talked about, we have 9 research themes in the program. There is overlap between the themes, but they all have their own specific focus that we think is a very key aspect of addressing sort of improving economies in these settings. In addition to the 9 themes, we also have 3 cross-cutting development issues. We know there's an overlap with some of the themes. So these cross-cutting issues are things that are particularly important across all of them. Many of the speakers so far have already made mention of the relationship between different things and climate change and gender aspects in lots of different ones outside of their main theme. And so I will come back to these when I talk specifically about the grants, but so you have reference. An important thing to note about our program, so we are funded by FCDO, which means the funding that goes into our program is ODA money. That does mean that the program as a whole is focused on low-income countries. So when that comes to the grant sphere, that does mean that projects that we are really particularly keen on are those that are specifically focused on low-income countries. Projects that are focused on countries of other classifications, we will still accept applications, but there will need to be some kind of justification that the lessons being learned from that research are applicable in low-income settings as well. So we have 3 types of grants in the program, and I'll go through each of them individually. So the first one are our compact research grants. These are the most common ones that we'll be giving out. We consider them our smaller of the grant options. So the first round, we will actually be releasing publicly all the information for it in the coming weeks, so before the end of the month. The grants value in range between £10,000 to £25,000. And they go for about 12 months. So the aims of the smaller grants are to fund sort of projects that are looking at new approaches. I know some of the researchers already have talked about interesting methodologies and approaches in their own areas. So this is kind of the funding vehicle for people to do a bit more of exploratory work in those kind of spheres. We're also very keen to fund researchers who might be not able to find funding elsewhere, so particularly looking at PhD students and also researchers based in low-income countries. We talked about localization yesterday, so this is a really key aspect for us as well. So, as I said, the focus, we have a research strategy for ReCIPE. This is currently available, or will be available on our website, but it does go through each of these themes. All of our lovely theme leaders have contributed to that. And then in terms of the eligible activities, it's quite a broad net. So we appreciate that support for research can come in lots of different forms, and people are doing very different things with this funding. There's a couple of things that aren't on that list, but we do have specific budget guidelines that people can refer to, or they can reach out to us if they're uncertain if an activity would be eligible or not. And as I said, in terms of researcher eligibility, so we are open to researchers from all over the world, I will say, except for those based in Russian institutions at present. But these grants are open to people who are currently completing a PhD or people who already hold a PhD. In addition to the CRGs, as we call them, we have our specifically PhD grants. These follow a very similar structure. They're also for 12 months. They're slightly less of a value, but I will say for the PhD ones, we do also have the option for people to include in their budget a research stipend so that PhD students can alleviate their sort of teaching requirements in order to focus on projects, which we, from our experience in the other programs, is extremely popular. And then we have our big research grants, or BRGs. So these ones are, as you can see, substantially larger. So these they also go for double the amount of time. So our CRGs and the PhD grants are only 1 year. The big ones are 2 years. They do fund similar types of activities, but the big research grants, obviously, the proposal process for that has to be a lot more in-depth. We're looking for bigger projects, but the types of activities are relatively similar. A thing to note with the BRGs is that the contract for those is with an institution. So typically in our other programs where we have a similar mechanism, we receive applications from research teams and the contract will go to someone's host institution. Then we have, I will just go through briefly on the application process for our CRGs and PhD grants because it's exactly the same. And this is the one that we'll be starting first. So applications are made through the ReCIPE website. If you're looking for the ReCIPE website, type in ReCIPE and CEPR, because if you type in ReCIPE, you're not going to find what you're looking for. So the applications for these both they're relatively short in scheme of things, so there's a few details to put into the form that we have online. The main document to prepare is the project proposal, but it's only approximately about 5 pages in there, covering things you'd expect. And then, so a note on the criteria. We do have a bit more information that will be available. This is just a summary, but we are looking for different things. We'll be having our evaluation rounds done by our lovely theme leaders as well. So these are people who will be able to identify some particular points there. I will say if people are interested in applying and they want to get a better idea of what we're looking for, I would highly recommend that they read our research strategy and that they look at our budget guidelines document. But none of these should really come as a surprise in terms of criteria. And then I just wanted to make a small note on the other upcoming activities that we have. So as I said, the grants are sort of the main part of our program, but we do a wide range of other activities. These are the next ones just coming up in the next few months. So in particular, we have an online course coming up. It's taught by our theme leaders. Similar to the conference, it's kind of structured around exploring each theme and to give students a sort of better idea of the sort of topics we're interested in, but also sort of the lay of the land with research as it currently stands. So that will be beginning on the 6th of March, running until the 29th of May, with a couple of breaks in there as well. I would highly encourage people to share that widely. The idea with the course is that it is targeted to people who have a non-technical background in these areas. So I know I've got a little bit lost with some of the explanations of the equations in the last couple of days. And if you're like me, you should be able to follow along with these presentations as well. So, and then we, as I said, we have our first round is the CRGs, which will open next couple of weeks, but we have the other 2 rounds, which will then repeat later on in the year. So they're our main activities coming up. But in terms of following what's happening, knowing what's going on in the program, what's available in lots of different ways, I would strongly encourage people to sign up for our mailing list. It's one of the main ways in which we will let you know what's coming up and all the new things that we've got happening. But as I said, that is the actual website, so you don't have to type it into a search engine and try and find it. But for those of you who are here, I'm around all day, so if you have any specific questions, feel free to ask me today. Otherwise, we can also be reached via email. That's all I have. I think it's time. Thank you so much, everyone. And then, Oliver will come and do the introduction, I guess. Is it Minji first?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we're following the exact same format as yesterday. Today we have two poster presentations. So in each case, the presenter will introduce them for about 10 minutes. We won't have questions, but like yesterday, we really hope that you keep your questions and you go and talk to the presenters during the lunch break where the posters will be displayed. First poster is Minjae Xu.
So hi everyone, and thanks for including our paper in this session. I'm currently a third-year student from Uni Mannheim, and this is a joint work with Yatang from Hong Kong UST. So to briefly motivate this project, conflict and the lack of infrastructures are two major barriers to economic development in African countries. The recent decades have witnessed a surge of infrastructure constructions, including the traditional donors like World Bank and African Development Bank, new initiatives led by long-term investors, including EU and G7, and new donors, including China, with its flagship Belt and Road Initiative. Both the local government and the international donors highlight the potential of these projects to generate immediate employment opportunities, highlight long-term economic growth potentials, and enhance state stability. Meanwhile, there are countless news reports suggesting infrastructures inadvertently contribute to violence and demonstrations. And here we have South African people protesting against Western mineral and energy colossals, and also demonstrations and violence against roads and dams financed and constructed by China. So we, in this project, we asked the research question. We try to understand the multifaceted treatment effect of infrastructure projects on conflict dynamic and understanding the underlying mechanisms. To do that, we compiled a new geo-coded infrastructure project dataset by harmonizing various informations from independent data sources. We ended up with 1,000 projects, which we could track either the exact location or the entire distribution of this project, which is essential for our identification strategy, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Our basic analysis units are roughly 10 kilometer times 10 kilometer grid cells spanning the entire African continent and last for 2 decades. We used 2 measures of conflict: the deadly intense conflict, which uses the UCDP, and the demonstration, which includes riots and protests from ACLED. We use 2 identification strategies. Our baseline identification compares grid cells with and without projects before and after the announcement of project construction. And since we have the distribution of this project, we could enhance our baseline DID with a dynamic instrumental variable approach by constructing a hypothetical road network using Euclidean minimum spanning tree. For each grid cell, we constant the distance from grid cell centers to the nearest road network. Yeah. Okay. And we interacted with the time variant continental-wise cumulative length of these projects, whose annual increment is mainly driven by the financial probability of international and domestic donors. Okay, so what do we find? First of all, we document a negative relationship between infrastructure and violent conflict. The results are robust across 3 variable forms and 2 identification strategies. disaggregating the Uppsala conflict data by the conflict participant information, we find the results are mainly driven by actors with rebels involved instead of militia. Further categorizing rebels by their local capacity, that is, to what extent they're likely to raise revenues through taxation or looting and appropriation, we find the results are driven by rebels with high local autonomy, which is the usual stationary rebels, instead of the roving counterparts. Stationary rebels reduce their activities in what we term as base area, where the conflict incidents concentrate, are of better economic interest to these groups and are better protected. We interpret our results as the stationary rebels strategically reduce their activities near the project site in order to benefit from future economic development, which increases their tax revenues. That is, the opportunity cost of participating in conflict is extremely high when the group could reap the future economic benefit from these projects. On the other hand, we find a positive relationship between infrastructure and demonstration, and our analysis suggests land issue is pretty salient. Land acquisition could both be the direct consequence of project construction, which caused the displacement of local communities and forced them to leave their habitats, or it could be an indirect consequence of development prospects, which attract international investment and acquisitions for business activities, which increases a sense of deprivation as the local communities feel the economic benefits are reaped by foreign investors instead of being kept locally. We test our analysis in two contexts that are likely to exacerbate such land disputes. First, we find demonstrations only concentrate in regions specialized at agricultural production. This makes sense because in these areas, people are more dependent on land and they experience greater welfare loss from land acquisition. Secondly, we find the demonstrations are significantly higher in regions where politically marginalized groups reside. These areas are likely to experience excessive land acquisition, an empirical fact that we documented, and during the acquisition process, compliance to regulations and consultation with communities are less likely. The excluded ethnics demonstrate both because the context effect dominates the opportunity cost of demonstration, and also because the lack of effective negotiation forced them to take stronger response to resort. And to quickly conclude, we find the treatment effect of infrastructure are multifaceted, which decreases intense conflict by roughly 0.545%, but increased non-intense demonstrations. We interpret our finding as the opportunity cost channel dominates the decline of intense conflict, and the land acquisition and issues demonstrate the surge of non-intense conflict. And when it comes to the policy discussion, one crucial fact that have already been explicitly discussed yesterday is that there does not exist one size that fits all, which means policies tend to work for specific countries and for specific conflict. And in this paper, we show that the single policy, while effective in pacifying a certain type of conflict, might meanwhile exacerbate the risk of an alternative type of conflict. And our question is, does that further complicate the already super sophisticated policy debate? And our answer is no, because the two opposing evidence that we propose in our paper can actually be well reconciled by carefully identifying the potential losers and winners of these development policies. For the winners, the opportunity cost of conflict participation increases, which naturally drives down the conflict participation, while meanwhile, the losers might go to the street and demonstrate and protect their basic rights. And we think our papers is an evidence that suggests the importance of highlighting necessity to distinguishing between different conflict types. We're currently working on framing this paper, and we also propose other interesting complementary mechanisms. I don't think I have enough time to discuss them here, but I'm happy to talk with them during the break and listen from your feedbacks and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Okay, so my name is Tanya Bandula-Irwin. I'm a PhD candidate, hopefully for not too much longer, at the University of Toronto. But I wear a couple other hats that I think are relevant. So I'm also at the International Development Research Centre of Canada. We fund Global South research. We're a crown corporation of the government. And then also I'm with the International Centre for Tax and Development and at Northwestern University as an incoming postdoctoral fellow. And so the title here is When Armed Groups Tax Like a State. This is a little bit of a lie. I'm not going to present this, even though this is what's on the poster. I'm going to situate what is on the poster within my broader dissertation project, and then also talk about the next steps in the postdoc work, which I think is going to be probably fairly relevant to, or hopefully interesting to some people here. Oh, okay. Animations. Why armed group taxation? So observably, the proportion of armed groups that tax civilians has been increasing. This does tick up around the same time that we see an increase in incidence of civil conflict as well. So that's to be expected. But also at the same time, if we look at all of the institutions of rebel governance, armed group taxation is the most prevalent one among them. So groups that are engaging in rebel governance will be most likely to tax. It's very popular. The other reason is that we know that they're very good at it. So famously, Al-Shabaab collects more revenue than government. It's not the case anymore, but it was. You also probably have heard of ISIS's terrific tax infrastructures and their ability to collect revenue. Sometimes better and outperforming the government. So why armed group taxation in theory? And we already benefited a lot from the previous presentation on taxation, but pretty much in ordinary non-conflict circumstances, we would expect taxation to act as a vehicle for sustainable financing for development, fiscal space for development priorities, enhanced accountability and governance, and state building. And so I began this project with the question, do these effects translate to the context of armed group taxation? But it is a little bit of a nascent area of study. So while there is a wide and growing body of research on rebel governance, armed group taxation as one component of that is a little bit understudied. So before asking my big questions that I was super interested in, I had to ask some foundational questions. So first, under what conditions do armed groups tax civilians? When do armed groups tax in more organized ways? And when do armed groups tax in more contractual ways? So asking when do they do it? And when they do it, what shapes their variation? Okay, and as far as methodology goes, I first took a step back and I mapped out the taxing practices of 42 armed groups globally to identify variation and how and what armed group tax, just to sort of justify what it is or have an idea of what it is I'm explaining. And then the second part of it was a global quantitative analysis, and this is answering the first question about conditions that armed groups tax. And then finally, I did a comparative case analysis from 2 groups in the Philippines, which was process tracing to examine the development of their tax systems across time. And this is also my political science hat, so less numbers, more words, more history in this presentation for sure. Okay, so in mapping armed group taxation, we have heard armed group taxation and taxation in conflict context come up. We use one word all the time, well, sometimes 2, taxation and extortion interchangeably. I'm proposing that taxation does not just mean one thing, and it means different things in different places. That seems obvious, but through my mapping activity, I was able to really identify this, and I view armed group taxation as existing along 2 dimensions, less contractual or more contractual, and more organized and less organized. What does that mean in practice? Organization, it's their collection mechanism, their rules and procedures, the level of centralization, and other state-like behaviors. So do they have a tax bureaucracy, a tax office? Do they give receipts? And then in terms of contracts, what are their enforcement mechanisms? So is it violence or the threat of violence? Or do they enforce on a basis of a justification or purported use of tax? Is there an opportunity to bargain, both how much you pay and what you receive in return? And is there demonstrated evidence of reciprocity? But just really briefly, I'm just going to show the marginal effects plot for my first question about when armed groups tax. I made a couple of interventions here and things that I was trying to investigate, really limited by the data that I had. So the only data that we have is whether armed groups tax or not, nothing about how they do it. So that's what this question was answering. But first, I wanted to see an obvious question about capacity. So these first indicators, territory size, parity with the state government, and whether they're hierarchical and have a strong sort of sense of leadership. These were all positively associated with an increased prevalence of taxing civilians. I also wanted to look at the impacts of non-tax revenue. So does non-tax revenue crowd out taxation of civilians by armed groups? Another intervention I made is that I disaggregated non-tax revenue. So I looked at networked revenue, which I can get more into it when we chat, but that's including illicit revenues from trade and trafficking, mining and natural resources, violent revenue, which is pretty much kidnapping and piracy, and then foreign revenue, so money received from other armed groups like Al-Qaeda, etc., or states. And I found that networked revenues had a positive impact. So if they were already kind of operating widespread throughout territories, they were also more likely to tax civilians. And then a really strong and interesting effect on foreign revenue. So groups that received foreign revenue were much less likely to tax civilians. I also there's no significance here, but just believe me, I can explain it more if you don't trust me later. But the political wings, leftist ideologies and Islamic ideologies were all insignificant. So those actually did not impact the likelihood of whether groups would tax civilians. So we're seeing stronger effects in terms of feasibility and non-tax revenues in shaping whether a group will tax or not. But like I said, I'm more interested in variation. So that previous metric that I made across the 2 dimensions and these insights, I went to the field for 6 months in the Philippines, and I looked at these 2 groups, the Communist Party of Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And I looked at the development of their taxing practices across time by speaking to armed group members, civilians, the armed forces of the Philippines, and so on. And a story did start to emerge, which kind of aligned with these quantitative findings, and that these factors don't only shape whether they do, but how they do. So looking at the Communist Party of the Philippines, from their inception to the 1990s, they had a really heavy reliance on foreign funding. So from China, from their really strong relationships with the Catholic Church and the money that came in through there, and other above ground NGOs. They did not have a significant focus on taxation despite being a communist group. So that was very surprising. There's a shift to taxation in the 1990s, and this happens after the end of the Cold War. They lose their funding from China, and there's crackdowns on communists by the government within the country, which persist to date. During this time, there's a shift to domestic taxation, and if anyone's familiar with the CPP-NPA, they are well known for their so-called revolutionary taxes. And this is a highly intricate and really hard to crack system by the government and foreign interventions. It's highly durable, and the CPP-NPA are super successful at collecting revenues from businesses and organizations, but less so on civilians. And this brings me to the next, from the 1990s onwards, so ever since they implemented this taxing system, they've had a really hard time applying it to civilians, and this is where feasibility comes in. They have these highly organized tax systems, but because of their loss of military strength and loss of territorial control, they have been really limited in their ability to apply this to civilians, even though they have every ideological interest to do so. Looking at the MILF, so this is an Islamist secessionist group in the south, part of the Mindanao conflict. They had minimal reliance on foreign funding because the MNLF, their predecessor rebel group, captured most of it. And even when they emerged, most foreign sympathizers or most foreign funders continued to give money to the MNLF. So what did the MILF do? They relied primarily on their illicit economies, local businesses, and community contributions. They also benefited from really good territorial security. They had these camps that are more or less communities where the MILF rebels and communities and civilians live together. And this deep community embeddedness provided financial stability and security, which reduced the need for organized tax systems. They slowly developed tax systems, but they leveraged kind of pre-existing institutions related to their community embeddedness. And that mostly took the form of zakat. So they worked with the mosques, and there's really clear evidence, at least from what I understood, that the money that was being raised and leveraged in the mosques were being transferred to the MILF. But they didn't really develop formal taxing systems until they assumed roles in governance. So it was a really slow, gradual development, and governance and the relationships with civilians came first before taxation. A bit of a surprise to me. I was thinking that the state building process would happen. I was thinking the communists who taxed would have this sort of great relationship with civilians, and in fact it wasn't the case. So it was these non-tax revenues and this security and this community embeddedness that enabled the MILF to build a more contractual relationship with civilians. So even though a group taxes like a state, we're not necessarily going to see those more transformational outcomes of taxation. I think we've covered this, and I think I'm running short on time because I really want to talk about this. So we're developing an armed group tax data set to capture variation across time and cases. It's currently in progress. We're in the throes of it. It's in collaboration with the Center on Armed Groups and the International Center for Tax and Development, with some nascent funding from the Canadian government to start. The research aims, so exploring broader patterns in armed group taxation. Again, the more interesting component is this variation to me anyways, and then exploring implications for state building, intersections with governance and service provision, and the impacts on conflict dynamics. For example, if a group taxes in more contractual ways, are they more likely to transition to government? The case of the MILF would suggest yes. And work with us. So we're looking for collaborators. It will be an expert survey on how we're going to populate most of it. So if you think you could be that person, let me know. Otherwise, thank you.